My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And when the microscope breaks, it magically returns.
So, Beef Pork Ribs, we haven't talked about Doom's delays in a while, and that's there are, people might be wondering, yes, movie releases are being shifted, but admittedly, most of them are for movies I don't even know what they are, and they don't really seem to fit into the broad spectrum of what we would talk about. The only one that has had a release date change that is related to what we would normally talk about is Morbius. I just need a moment.
The Marvel vampire nobody wanted.
I can't believe this is a movie that got made. Anyway, its release date has been shifted from January 21st, 2022 until January 28th, 2022.
Oh, wow. A whole week.
I just don't understand. If a movie's already coming out so far away, what is shifting the release date one week matter?
I have no idea, but I'm guessing there's some kind of a domino effect involved. That's my best guess. That's as far as I'm guessing today.
Sony, if you're listening to this, please just throw this movie on a streaming service now. Like, don't make us wait until next January to see it, because
we're really excited to see it.
I mean, it was supposed to come out summer 2020, and the fact that they think this is a movie people will actually go and see is laughable. I think the only reason people are interested in it is because Michael Keaton shows up at the very end of the trailer, which leads to speculation that it's set in the same world as Spider-Man Homecoming.
Okay, but I mean Michael Keaton, right? No, I'm not that big of a Michael Keaton fanboy, but he was the best thing about that Spider-Man movie.
Yeah. Anyway,
that's my hot take on him.
Yeah, so things seem to be trucking along here. Thankfully, there's no other Doom's delays that are relevant for us. I had a realization on Friday that I haven't left the house outside of checking my mailbox, which is like across the street. Like I don't get door-to-door mail anymore. We got one of those community mailbox things. And outside of checking the mail, I hadn't left my house in like 6 days. And so I did get out of the house today, went for a little drive. It was nice.
Those are some weak numbers. Anyways, no, I'm kidding. I mean, I had to do a full 2 week isolation at some point, and that was pretty bad. I'm pretty lucky, actually. I might start being in my house a bit more because teaching has gone back online. Yay, said nobody. I mean, but I still have the option of going to my school. It's just the students aren't there, so we'll see.
Yeah, I've been working from home now for just over a month, I would suppose. And obviously, like when the pandemic started, like everyone was working from home for months on end. But I guess now that I've had a taste of like being back in the office, like every time there is one of these lockdown, shutdown situations, it's harder and harder to just adjust to continue working from home.
Yeah, and I think that's what most people are finding is the hardest thing is just going back and forth between the two. Because once you're starting to get a bit of a routine for online, then suddenly you're allowed to go back to work, and you're so excited that you just go back to work, and then you're back online a few weeks later, just as you were getting your back to work groove on.
So if anyone listening to this has also been spending lots of time indoors, try to follow. I'm trying to give myself this advice to just get outside more. Like if you're not getting outdoors at least once a day, even just to go for a walk, give it a shot. The outdoors, it's a nice place.
It's the main reason I might be working from the school is because it's a 40-minute walk, so it forced me to get exercise and outdoor time.
Anyway, public service announcement over. Today, we are talking about a hypothetical situation. This is, I think, our first time really doing a what if sort of episode where we're speculating on a potential reality where something happened differently. And it's related to the death of Superman story. Now, we did an episode kind of covering the death of Superman storyline. This was like, I don't even remember when it was. It was episode 85, whenever that was. It was, a while ago now. But Beef Fork Ribs, obviously, since you weren't part of that episode, do you have like a secret origin segment with the death of Superman story? Or have you read it before? Tell our people.
There is a video on YouTube that features Elijah Wood about that. I don't remember what the video is really. I do remember that that's why I looked into what the death of Superman was. And I remember Elijah Wood was in it, and I believe had big, like, googly eyes, kind of like one of those filters you put on Instagram. I tried to find it on YouTube, and I couldn't find it. But it made me vaguely aware of what the death of Superman was and kind of what it started. And I guess the deep legacy we're going to talk about of making things not good. I don't know.
So have you never you've never really read the comic book story itself?
I did not read the comics themselves, no.
Okay. Yeah, because we were alive when this happened in the early 1990s, but neither of us were of comic book reading age yet. So we kind of just sort of, grew up in a in a world where this has already happened. Based on what you generally know, do you recall what the story of the death of Superman is?
Superman dies and then comes back alive. I mean, there's more to it. Darkseid kills him, and people are very sad about it. And then it sold really well, and then they realized that, oh, wait, we don't have Superman anymore, we can't sell comics, and brought him back to life.
You're going to make the people angry in the comments. It wasn't Darkseid.
It wasn't?
It was a new character they created called Doomsday.
Oh, yeah, I did know that. Yes. I do get those two mistaken a lot, though.
I mean, they're both gray monster type guys whose names start with the letter D, so of course, it's easy to get them confused. Now, in the episode we did before on the death of Superman, we kind of talked about the real world origin story of the death of Superman series, and it's quite interesting, and so I kind of want to revisit it here. Are you at all familiar, Beef Pork Ribs, with the television series Lois and Clark?
No, but I can guess what it's about.
So it's a live action TV show that aired from like 1993 to like 1997. And it was kind of, instead of being a show about Superman, it was generally more of a kind of a romantic show focusing on the relationship between Lois and Clark. It was literally subtitled The New Adventures of Superman.
Isn't it getting like a reboot?
So there is another show out now called Superman and Lois, which is also kind of focused on their relationship, but this time around they're married and they have teenage sons.
Oh, it's that. Okay.
And that's set in the Arrowverse, so that's connected to other shows that have come out in years recently. But Lois and Clark was, at the time, a new idea because no one had ever thought to, I guess, make a whole TV show focused on the relationship between Lois and Clark. Because, of course, in the comic books there had always been that kind of like weird romantic love triangle where Lois loves Superman and Clark likes Lois, but then Lois won't give Clark the time of day because she's so focused on Superman. And of course, they're the same person, and they had never figured it out. So you never even knew that the show happened, eh?
I have hated not being able to tell you this. I mean, you think it was easy for me sitting there and watch you swoon over Superman at the same time ignoring me?
That's ridiculous. You are Superman.
No. Lois, Superman is what I can do. Clark is who I am. And the closer we've gotten, the more I've wanted to explain this to you, but it just kept getting so complicated.
Well, you've obviously had more time to think about this than I have, so why don't you answer one question for me? How can I ever trust you again?
No, I was aware of Smallville being a different look at Superman, but I that was the first time I've heard about that. But I'm assuming the comic the comic storyline originated from it.
Well, in a sense. So in the early 1990s, after 50 years of Superman being a thing, the writers finally decided to kind of let Lois Lane find out that Clark Kent was Superman. And at this point, Lois and Clark in the comic books had started like a romantic relationship, so it was kind of like the next gradual step that Clark is going to trust her and reveal his identity to her. And it was a big thing that finally Lois was kind of in on the whole thing, that it was no longer like he was kind of keeping that secret from her.
And immediately came back to bite them.
Well, and at this point in time, there were 4 different Superman comic books being published every month. So basically, like every week, if you want to, you could go out and buy a different comic books featuring Superman. Why that's important is because the creative teams for all these different comic books would get together once a year to kind of map out all the Superman stories for the year and kind of make sure they weren't copying each other or they weren't contradicting each other. And they had, the year was like 1992 and they called it the Superman Summit they had every year. And they kind of came up with a year-long storyline that was going to lead up to the Lois and Clark getting married, because they had kind of obviously built it up over the years prior, him revealing his identity to her, them being in a relationship, that was going to be the natural progression for them to get married. Does that make sense to you that they would want to, coordinate their efforts for the sake of building up to a wedding?
I mean, somewhat. It still seems like I understand. Wait, this is pre-crisis?
It depends on what crisis you're referring to. This is like 7 years after the Crisis on Infinite Earths reset everything.
Oh, then no, I don't understand why they wouldn't just assume they were on different Earths.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just have the 4 of them set in different alternate realities, and then don't bother to figure out whether they make sense together or not.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's that's certainly an approach I don't think they've ever taken. I think,
yeah, because I feel like in a pre-crisis world, that makes a lot of sense. But after DC had done their Crisis series and had started going into the different Earths, trying to justify why the Golden Age of comic was different from the Silver Age, what's the point of still trying to make sure that everybody has the same Superman story when you could just be different Superman?
Well, you might be getting your wires crossed, because this is the time when they were trying to limit everything to one universe, because this is after the Crisis where they kind of killed all the alternate universes.
Right. Oh, right. But it still seems like
the fact that there were 4 different Superman books is kind of, it's like, that seems like, I realize he's a popular character, but like, to me, like, that's kind of like diluting your brand to have that many different books you can buy every month with the same character in them.
Well, especially if they are going to be set in the same universe.
Exactly. So, but here's where it gets really interesting, is that Lois and Clark was being developed for television, and the television producers came in and told DC Comics that they wanted to tell the story of Lois and Clark getting married first. And so that, I don't know how they found out that they were like planning this wedding storyline for the comic books, but they like and I don't know how they had the authority to do this, but they told DC, you cannot tell the wedding story because we want to tell that story first on television.
So what you're telling me is, I was not aware of this, the death of Superman is just a giant middle finger to to Lois and Clark.
Well, basically, this is what happened. And what happened was, they'd done this whole summit thing where they had planned out their year of storylines, and then all of a sudden they get told, you can't do the wedding because this TV show wants to tell that story first. So all the stories they had come up with for the whole year had to get thrown out the window, and they had to, like, in a panic, kind of have another summit to plan out stories for the next year. And it was during those meetings where, kind of out of desperation, one of the writers was just like, why don't we just kill him off? Why don't we just kill him off? And I don't know if it was just like the air in the room, or they were like finally they were just so desperate for ideas they kind of like said, yeah, what if we did kill him off? And then they kind of like the creative juices started flowing, and the whole story that we know as the death of Superman came from that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm pretty sure part of the why didn't we kill him is still kind of a giant middle finger to the TV show, but I was unaware that was the origin, or maybe I was at some point when I watched that weird video with Elijah Wood, but we'll never know. Um,
But doesn't
but
that, I
okay,
mean, even years later, after talking about it on the previous podcast episode, it still boggles my mind because I'm like, surely the point of doing the Lois and Clark TV show was to introduce the Superman characters to a different audience. I don't think they were really banking on like comic book readers watching the show. So what would it matter to them and the people they're trying to reach with the show if the comic book, characters did the wedding first?
especially because, like, I don't know. Again, given the nature of comics, whether you have a multiverse or not, like, I don't know, like Archie did this like comic series where Archie gets married to Betty and to Veronica, and it was like alternate realities, and then they kept on making other comics where they're still in high school. Like, people aren't like, most people who aren't diehard fan of Archie might not even know that was made. And so, yeah, it seems a little bit silly that they were so desperate to be the ones to do it first. That, especially because I feel like it's a weird thing to do, because I think clearly a TV show that is acts around the relationship, everybody expects to get there, right? It's not like it's a hoo big thing. Like, as soon as you make a TV show in which you have two people who are romantically involved, you're just waiting for the wedding episode, right? Like, sitcoms, that happens all the time. It's like the whole Friends thing with Ross and Rachel is like, when they get married, the show's over. There's a few other shows where that happens. So, like, I don't understand why you would be like, no, this has to be us. Like, I'd understand it more if it was a reveal, like if they had wanted to be the first ones to have Clark admit to Lois Lane that he's Superman. Like, that would be a different thing entirely, because you're not necessarily expecting that to happen immediately. But it still has the same logic that, obviously, like, if you have a show based around a superhero and his love interest, eventually he's going to tell her and they're going to get married. Or
Yeah,
she'll end up in the fridge.
there was a novel element of Lois. I've never actually watched a whole episode of Lois and Clark. I've just seen random clips. But when I hear people talk about, they kind of emphasize that what made that show unique, at least for Superman's perspective, is that unlike the movies where they kind of portray like Clark Kent as like this kind of like act that he puts on, and Superman seems to be more of like who he genuinely is that they kind of portray as like, no, Clark Kent is more of like his actual who he is. And then Superman is kind of like this exaggerated kind of performance he puts on to like, draw people's gaze away from him really being Clark Kent.
Yeah,
So
something that Smallville kind of built up on too.
yeah, that's a good tie-in as well. But anyway, all I have to say, Lois and Clark did end up getting to do the wedding first, and the show was canceled shortly after that. So we can argue that none of this was worth it, and there could be like an alternate universe where DC could have just said, no, like, we're not going to bow to your demands, Lois and Clark producers, and the death of Superman would have never happened. That storyline would have never happened at all.
I guess it needs to be Lois and Clark, because Clark and Lewis is different.
Well, yeah, Lewis and Clark. I think they were trying to draw a reference there. So that in terms of thinking like alternate worlds or different what if scenarios, like the first what if scenario is like, well, what if Warner Brothers and DC came to a different agreement and they just allowed the comic book to do the wedding first? Do you, I mean, you don't even know about Lois and Clark as a show, but do you think it would have negatively impacted the show if they had just had the wedding storyline happen in the comics first?
Sorry, if there would have still been a TV show?
No, like would the TV show have actually been negatively impacted by having the comic books do the wedding first.
Not even a little bit. I don't think. I think it would have lived and died on its own merits, as often has. As I think, if you look at more examples of TV show based around both animated and live action, based around superheroes, they tend to live and die on their own merits, not on anything that has to do with the comics. And the movies have a very similar thing too.
So there you go. That answers the first question. If the original decision to axe the wedding storyline to do the death Superman never happened, everyone probably would have worked out fine. But let's orient ourselves. Let's go back to the early 1990s. We were babies. We don't really remember this, but that was a time in comic books where characters like Superman were declining in popularity. Characters who were kind of like seen as like the gold standard of like what it means to be a good guy. That time in the late 80s and early 90s saw the emergence of a lot of kind of darker, more
Spawn,
violent
Constantine.
Spawn's the perfect example. There was this period that they call it the Image Revolution, where this company called Image Comics kind of popped out of nowhere. Are you familiar with Image Comics?
You'd have to give me some titles, not offhand.
I mean, like Spawn's kind of their biggest thing, but like Savage Dragon,
Okay.
Rob Liefeld did a lot of stuff for them. Basically, all you and our listeners need to know is that it was a company run by writers and artists. You know, there is a big issue with Marvel and DC to this day where, you know, none of the creations made by the writers and artists belong to them. They belong to the company. And so Image Comics was created by writers and artists who were kind of tired with the corporate structure of DC and Marvel, where writers and artists could contribute and create series and characters for Image Comics, but then they would own the rights to those characters.
Right. I think we talked about that at some point already when we were talking about legacy characters, I believe.
Yeah, we might have mentioned it during the conversation about the boys as well.
Yeah. And I mean, legacy characters has a decent amount of, I think, crossover with the other part of what we're going to be talking about this comic series.
Yeah, so this idea of the Image Revolution is like Image Comics came out and all these independently created comic book series were super creative and innovative, and they kind of like pushed the envelope as to what was acceptable for the mainstream because, you know, DC and Marvel were both relatively safe in what they were willing to publish with their main characters. So there were all kinds of people lining up outside the block buying up these Image comics like Spawn. Spawn's kind of like the best example of this sort of character and this sort of comic book which was popular at the time. And if you've seen images of Spawn, he's got skulls on him and he's got black and big chains and green eyes, and you know, he's like an agent of hell. Like he's a very edgy character, almost like you could say the opposite of Superman. So once they got the direction that they had to like make up a new storyline, and once they entertained this idea that, yeah, let's kill off Superman, the writers kind of got this sense that people were taking Superman for granted, that, oh, it's like, you know, he's always there. He's too reliable. So let's make our audience like really realize what life would be like without him. And that sort of came forth this idea of, well, if we did kill Superman, what would happen in the comics? And to their surprise, when it got out into the news that Superman was going to die, it actually got like mainstream media coverage, like CNN, Entertainment Tonight, all these like major television outlets were doing news stories about the fact that Superman was going to die in the comics.
DC Comics confirms that a character named Doomsday will kill Superman. Why?
After 50 some odd years, to get people to notice, sometimes you have to go to extremes.
You see, Superman has an image problem. Did you hear what happened or what's going to happen?
No.
He's going to die.
Oh, good. I'm an anti-Superman fan. I don't like him. He's like a Boy Scout compared to other superheroes.
This from a guy who wears a tattoo of a bad guy, the Joker.
It's one of those things where, like, even if he was declining, Superman is still the best-selling comic book character of all time. Still, you know, a mainstay. I'm assuming he still was at that time, you know, a more profitable character. Maybe not immediately, but still historically than anything else.
Yeah, definitely.
Not
Like
to
you
mention,
talk
like,
about,
just his place in pop culture, Superman is, everybody's aware of who he is generally.
yeah, but unfortunately, general awareness doesn't necessarily translate to. I'm sure he makes a lot of money in merchandise, but in terms of like actual comic book sales, Superman was definitely on a decline at the time. And so there was not only just mainstream media coverage, but lots of people who weren't even reading comic books were all of a sudden interested in hearing about Superman dying. And I think you can tell that a lot of like non-comic book readers went in to buy Superman 75, the issue where he dies, because if you're a comic book reader, you know that it's very common practice for characters to die and then come back. Well, even then, even at that point, I feel like there were probably like at least 4 occasions where like Superman might have died in an issue and then come back later in the same story.
But I feel like even those ones, it was always a lot more about creating fake tension rather than trying to actually do it.
What do you mean
Because,
by fake tension?
well, uh, like in the death of Superman, there seemed to have actually been the intention to keep him dead. You know what I mean? Rather than just it being like a fake out, oh no, this person is dead, but then they show up later and it's like, haha, that's what we had planned the whole time. Don't worry about it. He's never going to die. It's a different type of writing, I guess.
Right. And I don't, again, they were kind of given the directive to do something different. So I don't think their intention was to try and like shock and awe the world and get a bunch of people interested. But you know what? Like they ended up selling like 6 million copies of that comic book where Superman dies. And I feel like a lot of people who came and bought that one issue where he does die did not stick around to keep reading, because after Superman died, they did like a little short story over a couple issues called "Funeral for a Friend," where like obviously like showed all the aftermath and like elements of Clark's funeral and whatnot. And then they ceased publication on all Superman comics for like 3 months. There were like 3 months that went by where there were no Superman books at all. So it really did seem, at least in the general public, that they were at least for a little while kind of pausing the idea of Superman comics being a thing at all.
Which once again kind of gives rise to the fact that they might have been serious about keeping him dead.
Yeah, and this is again like thinking about, well, what if he never died? I think if this had not happened, I think Superman probably would have just continued on a downward spiral in terms of popularity. He probably would have been like somewhere near the bottom in terms of actual sales, because I think their intention of actually like drawing people to the awareness of like, yeah, like what if Superman wasn't around anymore? Like all of a sudden you'd have so much more appreciation for him. And I think like even the characters in the story kind of went through that same experience. If they never went that way and they just did the wedding story like they'd intended, I'm sure they might have gotten a little bump in sales because it's a big deal that for them to get married, but there would not have been the same kind of recognition in universe and in like the real world of Superman's importance as a character.
I mean, I guess, but it also kind of, because a lot of other things started coming afterwards in which Superman was pretty prevalent. That, like, I don't know if it would have necessarily stopped people from taking him for granted, but it might have, like, and again, I think that there is a certain disconnect between the comics and mainstream media. Like, even if that hadn't gotten the kind of attention, like media attention it got, it might have kind of flown under the radar a little bit. So I think it probably has more to do with the fact that it received, like, that people reacted to it as it was happening as a serious threat and as a shock rather than an actual appreciation for Superman as a character, because I feel like that has he's continued to be in other things, and he probably would have continued to be in other things, like Justice League Unlimited, just like the Justice League movies, all those kind of things would have probably still happened, and he's still one of the founding members of the Justice League. He still would have been in them. So I don't know to what degree it saved him as a character. if you follow my thinking. And because I think personally, whenever people talk about the death of Superman, they talk a lot more about the effect on what to do with characters and how it kind of made changes to the comic industry rather than Superman as a character.
Right. Now that makes sense. It's still either way. I think Superman's image or his reputation or it would have been impacted in a way we can't even measure. But
Yeah, for sure. But again, it is hard to measure because he still would have appeared in other things that might have, you know, pushed his character and might have also given him a different character progression if they were trying to hype him up in the comics, right?
right. Well, the creative team at Superman, all the different writers of the different books kind of each had a different idea about like, oh, like how can we bring Superman back? And instead of like deciding, oh, like this will just be the way, they're like, well, why don't we just do all these ideas since we have the 4 books? And you can, if you look at the next kind of the final part of the Death of Superman story is called Reign of the Supermen. So after the 3-month kind of blackout period, they restarted all the Superman books, and each book featured a different character claiming to be the next Superman or to being Superman. So you had literally one that was a cyborg Superman, and so he was like part robot, and he claimed to be like constructed from the remains of Superman's body.
Yeah, I remember that.
You had the Eradicator, who called himself the last son of Krypton, and so he had like big goggles he wore on his head, and he had like a different Superman costume that had like black and blue up and down the body of it, and he shot energy beams out of his hands, which was, you know, much more like a in tune, I guess, with what characters were doing at that point in the 90s. You had Steel, who was literally like a man in like a armored suit, not unlike Iron Man, except he had a big hammer, so he was kind of like Thor, and he had a red cape like Thor too. Actually, now that I think about it, so and he was notable because he was an African American character, so it was like a
Yeah,
relatively.
I remember that as well.
And then they also had a new version of Superboy. Now, up until this point, Superboy had just been like a teenaged version of Superman from like when he was younger. So this was the first time Superboy was introduced as like a separate character, and initially he's just presented as like a younger version of like Superman.
Yeah,
But
Superman who works for Kennedy.
for Kennedy,
Yeah, for JFK. That's one of the things Superboys did when originally.
oh, gotcha, yeah. Now this one worked more for Lex Luthor, but he had the personality of like the MTV generation. He was like that, yeah, man, I've got earrings and leather jackets, and I'm cool, and forget that, you know, he was very much that personality type. So it's funny to me to think about that period because the reign of the Supermen kind of went on for like 6 months before they finally kind of brought back the real original Superman. And you get a sense that like all the writers were like trying to respond, I guess, to what was popular in comic books at that time and trying to like make a Superman version of those things. And, you know, that's one of the big impacts certainly is that like, you know, both the Eradicator and Cyborg Superman did not stick around, but Steel and this version of Superboy became characters that kind of became part of the DC universe after this event. So certainly if the death of Superman never happened, those characters wouldn't have been created.
Yeah, and some of them, but none of them ever rose to the same prominence that Superman had. It's still like it still took him returning for those kind of comics to really strike out.
Yeah, but this Superboy was a, you know, a founding member of Young Justice, and he became like a big part of the Young Justice TV show, and Steel had that movie with Shaquille O'Neil in it. So
Oh, yeah, but we're talking about positive impacts here.
well, I'm just saying that if the death of Superman hadn't happened, that means we wouldn't have had to deal with that movie. So, you know, I guess that's
Oh
one
yeah, I
positive.
guess that is another. But you know, would we have still had Shaq Fu? No, Shaq Fu was before that, I think.
Well, and Kazam, don't forget about Kazam.
Oh yeah. Actually, now I'm just curious as to which one of those movies did Shaq do first.
So yeah, despite
'Cause that might just change his entire film career. You never know.
that's true, Shaq could have been the biggest movie star in the world. Who knows?
He could have been the first The Rock.
Yeah, maybe he would have been in Space Jam instead of Michael Jordan.
Oh, I would pay to see that.
So despite like in the real world, in like the timeline we live in, despite the kind of boost in sales and the press that the Death of Superman got, within like 6 months of him returning from the dead, he kind of like returned to like the stagnant level of popularity he had before. And I don't know if Superman's ever really, I think Batman has always been like the number one selling character at DC, and I don't think Superman's ever since gotten to that level of popularity again. So yeah, I don't have to, I'd
I'm
have to
just
look at,
surprised because he's still historically outselling Batman.
for sure. And we'd have to look at sales figures or something to verify that. That's just a sense I have, considering that there are still like 4 different Batman comics being published every month, where I think there's only like 2 Superman ones. And then I don't know if you want to count like Supergirl and Superboy as Superman books, because they're got his like branding, but he's not in them.
Yeah, maybe.
But I watched a YouTube video yesterday where they were talking about the impact of the Death of Superman storyline and what
Was
they
Elijah Wood in it?
emphasized. Sorry?
Was Elijah Wood in it?
No, Elijah Wood was not in
Okay.
it.
I need to find that video and show it to you.
What they tried to say was that what the Death of Superman did is that it made changing the status quo in comic books.
Right. Trying to constantly shake things up.
Exactly. So what would get your casual readers to pick up books is constantly having new storylines that were shaking up what was perceived as the kind of standard operating procedures for the series. And, in the wake of the Death of Superman, you saw stories like Nightfall, where Batman gets his back broken, or the Clone Saga, where Spider-Man finds out that he wasn't actually Peter Parker. And there was like an Avengers storyline called like Heroes Reborn, where a lot of the Avengers are seemingly killed off. And I kind of see that persist to this day. That seems like, and admittedly, I don't buy comic books anymore. But what gets my attention is when there is some kind of like news-shattering character is dead, new person is taking on this mantle, Spider-Man's getting a new costume, like that. Those kind of like, I guess, clickbait headlines get my attention, and that admittedly kind of what gets me more interested in reading comics now. Which, if I can like all lead that back to the Death of Superman, if that hadn't happened, I don't know if that same trend would have maybe emerged from comic books.
I mean, a lot of people do. Once again, when we're talking about like legacy characters, it's paradoxically kind of similar things. Like having spin-offs and having legacy characters is still kind of connected, because when you are constantly changing the status quo, you are adding either alternate realities or just different versions of something that people thought still existed. But I think this is something that the Death of Superman does get blamed for, in a way, is like people writing different storylines that shouldn't match the character into this character. And of course, this becomes negative when it's made just for name recognition. And I think that's something that people are kind of somewhat upset, because it is clickbaity, like you said. It's not something new and original happened in the story. It's just something incongruent with the character of the universe is happening, and people are like, oh, what's that? As opposed to actually trying to craft something that actually works in a universe where it could work and where it could explore something different. It's like like some of them less so than others. Batman getting his back broken has become kind of iconic now, and it's obviously something that we're working into it a lot. But it was done exactly you said, just to like shake up interest rather than try to do something new and original. And I know, like, I'm sure we talked on the podcast before about like, well, we talked recently about, reboots 20 years later. Why is nobody doing anything original? Well, because doing things that are original is very risky, and you could just as easily do something new, but with something that already exists, then it already cuts the risk down significantly. Look at the new Joker movie, right? That wasn't a Joker movie. It wasn't a DC movie. It wasn't a Batman movie. It was a movie in which you put the Joker so that the movie you wanted to make would sell.
I'm also just realizing now, like, the Death of Superman story ends with Coast City being destroyed and like millions of people dying. And that led, the Coast City is the home of Green Lantern Hal Jordan. And so the ending of the Death of Superman story led to Hal Jordan kind of going nuts and murdering all the Green Lanterns of the Green Lantern Corps in an attempt to revive his hometown. And that led to him becoming a villain. And that led to a huge status quo change in the Green Lantern comics where there was just one Green Lantern in the whole universe. So if the Death Superman story had never happened, none of that would have happened in the Green Lantern comics. We probably never would have gotten Kyle Rayner as a Green Lantern. And again, I don't know if the Green Lantern like just franchise would have just continued on into like kind of like stagnant popularity if it hadn't had those kind of ups and downs of like something big happening and status quo changing that the Death Superman kind of launched for it.
I feel like Green Lantern might have escaped that a little bit just because it is because it's always been, I don't know, Green Lantern has always been a little bit more original, if you know what I mean.
But what would they have done? Because at that point, like, everything was just hunky dory in the Green Lantern. Like, they would have had all those, like, I'm just saying, I guess it's hard to imagine what it would have looked like. They would have just sort of continued on as it was, and those shakeups, those changes wouldn't have even come into effect. And then,
but I also think that at some point something would have been done to shake up popularity. And I think the bigger, like, the question that we're faced with is really, would it have been new series or trying to make the old go through? And if I can just, like, for a second use my outside nerd knowledge of something else, like, I don't know if you're aware generally of like the series that ended this year for Weekly Shonen Jump, but like a lot of their big series are ending and they're stuck between throwing everything at the wall and see what sticks, and then trying to renew old things, and also trying to just add like new ideas to old concepts, or like they're in a period of transition, which I think is kind of similar to what was happening. And as you said, as a reaction to the Image Comics revolution, the idea was like, if they were imitating Image Comics, that meant that they were trying to do original things while still keeping their properties. And, would it have been better overall for the comic industry and for what's happening today if instead of throwing crazy things into franchises that already existed, they might have just created a bunch of new series or try to pass on the torch to different people in the same series? Because, like, and I think also for the Green Lantern, it's kind of a lesser example because the Green Lantern always had the ability to literally make anybody on Earth the Green Lantern, right? It already had built in that kind of ability to change. And a lot of other things might kind of have that, but Superman really is kind of stuck with Clark Kent.
The YouTube video I also watched made a point of saying that the Death of Superman kind of led to the comic book industry relying on events for sales and to get people excited. So again, if I think of some of the first comic books I ever read, they were part of like events like Maximum Carnage, where it was like, again, across several different books, and there was multi-parts, and you had to read the different chapters in each different comic book series. And this is an annoying thing that perpetuates to this day. Like, even just like, I think of like the first like three, like any comic book I've read in the last 10 years, it's usually like part something of something. It's certainly a gimmick now to get people to actually buy comics, because if you're just picking a random issue, it might be part 5 of 12 or whatever. And it's nice to think of a world where Death Superman never happened and that kind of trajectory of relying on events doesn't happen.
And I mean, Yeah, and it's one of those things. Again, event comics did exist before Death of Superman. They just were less common, and it did kind of transform in a certain way. Like you said, a lot of people are like, oh, are vaguely aware of these characters, and so when something strange happened in an event comic, they go for it. Which again, you could make an argument is good or bad for the fan base, because it's good in the sense that more people get into it, but it's bad because you get this kind of warped image in the public consciousness of what these superheroes are, kind of like how a lot of people are our age or around our generation grew up for probably a long time thinking that Spider-Man produced his own web organically because of the Tobey Maguire films, right? Uh, it's it does warp a certain sense, and I know there's a lot of comic book like fans of Spider-Man who are extremely upset about that, and I feel like it would just create, I don't know, it kind of creates this division, rather like it makes it more popular, but it still creates a division between the fans. Whereas if you do keep a status quo, then you are creating a much more niche culture, but one in which you do have, like, there is more value in remembering all the small details of every issue rather than just having to follow the major storylines.
Yeah, and I don't know how to qualify this, but there were a couple different people I saw in YouTube videos talking about the death of Superman as the thing that got them into comic books. So, it's a question asked. There might be people, like swaths of people, who like kind of came into comic books because of the buzz around the death of Superman and became comic book fans. So who knows? There may be people in this alternate timeline we're talking about that never became comic book fans because the Superman wasn't there to draw them in.
And yeah, and that's the problem with alternate realities, especially invented ones, is that there's not just long-ranging effects, but also butterfly effects to consider. And maybe a lot of those people wouldn't have become fans, and maybe they would have become fans for a different reason. Maybe they would have become Marvel fans, and Marvel would have been much bigger than DC earlier, and DC would have the movie universe that is breaking through and making everybody watch them.
And that kind of is like my last thing to kind of comment on is like, well, what if the death of Superman didn't happen? Obviously, all of the adaptations of the death of Superman story that we've gotten wouldn't have happened. So there's an example in the Justice League series. There's an episode called Hereafter, wherein Superman seems to have died, not by the hand of Doomsday, but by some other threat. And so they kind of do the whole funeral for a friend storyline, and all the characters mourn his loss. And then, it's discovered that he actually was just sent to like the far future, and he has to come back to the present before the two-parter's over. But that was a really touching episode of the show. And again, for the characters of that show and for fans like myself watching as a kid, helped me remember like how good a character Superman was. And there's like a nice moment where Batman goes to like his tomb and like says some nice things about him. Of course, there have been two different animated films directly adapting the death of Superman, one called Superman Doomsday, which came out in 2007.
Oh,
And
I
then
remember that. I remember seeing trailers for that. It looked really good.
yeah, it was like the first in the direct-to-video movies that Warner Brothers Animation did after Justice League Unlimited finished. And so it had like a PG-13 rating. There was more blood. It was a little more mature than like what you would have seen on TV. And I think if you want like a very condensed version of the death of Superman and the funeral for a friend and the reign of the Superman storyline, like that's the version to watch, because it kind of strips out like all the other Justice League characters and it takes out most of the other Supermen. It's a really like, I guess you want to say like condensed version of the story. But then in 2018, 2019, they did do a more direct adaptation of The Death of Superman as one movie and then Reign of the Superman as a separate film. And that one does feel in many ways more faithful to the original comic, because you have the Justice League characters there and you do see all four Supermen that come after him. And they do allow it more room to breathe because it is 2 whole movies as opposed to the Doomsday movie that condenses it into one. So obviously, none of those stories would have been told if Death of Superman hadn't happened. And then even when we think of the live action DC movies of the past few years, Batman versus Superman ends with Superman being killed by Doomsday. So obviously, if that story hadn't happened in the comics, they probably wouldn't have drawn inspiration from it for that movie.
Yeah, but it's also, there's also this kind of idea though that would Superman have never died, right? Because again, we're doing alternate realities, and you're right. There's a lot of things that are pretty directly influenced from that storyline, but a lot of those tropes, as you said, existed and were floating around. So it's not necessarily that everything would be completely different. It just probably would portray differently. And I mean, who knows what I just made up a theory that I like immensely, and that eventually we would have gotten Batman v Superman and the death of Superman together, and just forever in every movie it's always Bruce Wayne killing Clark Kent.
Well, this is what I'm hopeful, because this is one of the things I critique of those DC movies that Zack Snyder made, is that they rushed the death of Superman. You had one movie with Superman in it where he wasn't even like a beloved figure, and then you have him killed off in the next one. They rushed that storyline too much, and then he wasn't even dead like for a full year. If you think about it, by the time, I guess it was like a year and a half, I suppose, by the time the Justice League movie came out and he was resurrected. So I like to believe that in this world where the Death of Superman story didn't happen, there's a better version of Batman versus Superman that doesn't include a rushed adaptation of the Death of Superman, and Henry Cavill's Superman has more room to breathe. And obviously that changes like the whole narrative of the Justice League movie, and maybe that would have led to a better Justice League movie, and then we wouldn't have needed Zack Snyder's Justice League to come along. Yeah, you
Yeah,
see where I'm
and
going?
actually, I'm liking this alternate universe more and more, because then it means that if you don't have as many big, event comics, then the Age of Ultron movie might have never been made either, and that is a much better world than the one we live in.
And if we think about this holistically, it doesn't sound like you're convinced that all these things that can be tied back to the death of Superman, like the reliance on events or shaking up the status quo in comics, or the fact that Superman got more public attention. It sounds like you're not convinced that in the absence of the death of Superman, something else wouldn't have happened to also create those impacts.
I'm I'm not convinced, but I am split between the idea that these things would have happened anyway, because they are such basic ways to make money and to keep your characters going that somebody would have thought of them. But also, I kind of like to imagine in the alternate world where the death of Superman never happened, then Image Comic and independent comic artists and original content might have just become the norm. And I like that idea. But I think that overall things would have just, like, DC and Marvel would have, and Warner Brothers that was with them, would have found a way to just renew these characters for people, because let's be honest, it's what they've been doing ever since. And if it hadn't been triggered by that event, I think something else would have triggered it.
Yeah, so in the end, of course, we don't know the answers of what happened and like what the impact on the comic book industry would have been if that story hadn't been told. I do believe, though, that even though it wasn't the original intention to kill off Superman, that going through the whole motion of doing the death of Superman, the funeral for a friend, and the reign of the Superman, it did something, even if it was just for the comic book fans of the time, to kind of remind them of the importance of Superman as a character, and what it means to have somebody who is just a good person out there trying to set an example for others. I think that if he had not have gone, if they hadn't done all that, then it would have needed to happen at some point, or because you don't really, it's just a common kind of trope. You don't really realize like what you have until it's gone.
I think it's also depends a little bit on what your opinion is of Superman generally. But which despite the fact that I don't love him as a character, I still think that he is integral to the DC mythos and the DC universe working in the way that it does, mostly because of the way that he and Batman are foils to each other in a way that in a relationship that none of the other DC superheroes really share so as strongly. So it is still like, a good thing to have happen in a sense, but also, alternate realities are hard.
So in conclusion, Shaquille O'Neil would have been a bigger movie star.
Yes, absolutely.
There'd be a better version of Batman versus Superman, and we wouldn't have ended up with the Snyder Cut.
Or Age of Ultron. So, net gain altogether. If
Lois and Clark would have probably maybe been a better TV show.
Yeah, see?
Yeah, maybe this, I don't know. Anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this conversation, and if you disagree with us, please let us know, because once again, we have no mail.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
And let's be honest, nothing starts a heated debate quite like saying Superman should have never died, or talking about comics in general.
Yeah, and this episode was the result of someone writing in and giving us a suggestion for an episode. So naturally, we'd love to have more episodes like that.
Yeah, we love hearing from you guys, and I personally do actually quite enjoy the whole alternate reality discussions, because it does allow us to think outside the box sometimes, like Shaquille O'Neal's movie career. I had not thought we would talk about that when we talked about the death of Superman, but it's very relevant.
So next week, get over here. I guess it's fine. We're going to talk about the new Mortal Kombat movie. It's been out in theaters, I guess, mostly in the US for...
I strangely managed to get excited about this in the last week.
Oh, good. So I believe in Canada, you can get it from YouTube Movies or Google Play, whatever, or Cineplex. So like you can rent it online if you want to watch it before next week. And then if you're in the States, you can go see it in theaters, or if you have HBO Max, you can actually just watch it at no extra cost on HBO Max. You lucky people. I wish I had access to that. Anyway, come back to the Batshar Podcast next week when we talk about the new Mortal Kombat movie. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
Finish him!